Kendall stepped outside, taking a deep, calming breath, seeking solace from the overwhelming burden of knowing others' fates. The hustle and bustle of the small town momentarily faded as she closed her eyes. In this close-knit community, she was revered as the woman who could predict one's future by merely tracing the lines of their hands. To many, her gift was a blessing, a chance to peek into days yet to come. However, for Kendall, this ability often felt more like a heavy chain, weighing her down. The joyous moments were easy. When she saw love, prosperity, or imminent success, she would relay the message with a gleaming smile. The recipient's eyes would dance with excitement, their faces glowing with a mix of disbelief and joy. But not all futures were painted in bright colors. At times, the lines on a person's palm would tell tales of despair, trials, or the grim shadow of death. These readings, filled with darkness and uncertainty, were the hardest. How could she possibly shatter someone's hope with such news? The weight of responsibility made her heart heavy. To spare both herself and the person seeking insight, Kendall found a way to navigate these murky waters. Whenever she came across a future that was particularly troubling or foreboding, she'd simply say, "I see nothing." This phrase became her shield, a protective barrier between the harsh truth of fate and the hopeful hearts of the townfolk. The reactions were varied and intense. Some became agitated, their voices rising in anger, accusing Kendall of deception and trickery. Their faces would flush red, feeling betrayed by someone they trusted. In contrast, a few seemed to grasp the unspoken message behind her words. With a heavy sigh and a nod, these individuals recognized the weight of her silence. They'd murmur a quiet thank you, and then, with a somber demeanor, slowly walk away. Witnessing their drooping shoulders and downcast eyes, an overwhelming sadness tugged at Kendall's heart. Having built a reputation in the town, Kendall was often approached by familiar faces, eager for a glimpse into their destinies. Reading for friends and acquaintances was especially challenging for her. She feared that revealing certain futures could jeopardize the bond they shared. An unexpected revelation might lead to bitterness or mistrust. Yet despite her reservations, some were so persistent, believing that knowing the future would give them some semblance of control. Mrs. Bennet, with her fiery spirit and relentless curiosity, was a prime example. She would often corner Kendall during town gatherings, her eyes gleaming with excitement and expectation. Kendall could never turn her away, no matter how much she wanted to. Mrs. Bennet's tenacity always won out, leaving Kendall with the tricky task of interpreting her destiny. "Good day, Kendall," Mrs. Bennet's voice rang out cheerfully. Kendall spun around, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Ah, Mrs. Bennet, always a pleasure. How have you been keeping?" Mrs. Linda Bennet, despite her advanced age, was a whirlwind of energy and enthusiasm. Her life's journey had taken her through myriad roles, from the humble beginnings as a janitor to the noble task of teaching special needs children. These experiences, diverse and challenging, had carved out her unique spot in the community. Though she had retired 5 years ago, her passion for service was undimmed. Everywhere you looked, there was Mrs. Bennet, with her infectious enthusiasm. She could be seen reading to children in the local orphanage or organizing events at the senior citizens' home, making sure everyone felt loved and included. Her dedication earned her immense respect. In the tight-knit community, she was a beloved figure. "Kendall," Mrs. Bennet began, her voice teasing, "when are you going to spill the beans and read my palm?" Kendall laughed lightly. "Mrs. Bennet, with your vibrant life, what more do you want to know? You have wonderful children, a loving husband who cherishes every moment with you. What more could you ask for?" Mrs. Bennet raised an eyebrow playfully. "I've got 3 big celebrations around the corner. What if I don't make it to them?" "Ah, come on now," Kendall replied, her voice light with amusement. "I'm certain there are many, many more celebrations in store for you." Mrs. Bennet's eyes twinkled. Life is full of surprises, isn't it? As they continued chatting, Kendall noticed a subtle shift in Mrs. Bennet's demeanor. It was evident she had something more pressing on her mind. Sensing this, Mrs. Bennet leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "Kendall, I've been meaning to ask you something." Kendall nodded, her face serious. "I'm all ears, Mrs. Bennet." Mrs. Bennet spoke animatedly about a young man she had recently met at the disability center where she volunteered. The boy, likely in his mid-teens, navigated the world from a wheelchair. His movements and the visible scars hinted at a traumatic event in his past that might have robbed him of his ability to walk. But what truly piqued Mrs. Bennet's interest was the enigma of his life story. His memory of his childhood was a blank slate, and details about his parents were foggy at best. What he could recall were mere flashes, disjointed snippets that didn't form a complete picture. Yet beneath his amiable exterior, there was a palpable longing, a desire to understand where he came from and if somewhere in the vast world his parents might still be searching for him. Mrs. Bennet's eyes danced with hope as she relayed this to Kendall. After hearing his tale, I couldn't help but think of you. With your special talents, perhaps you could offer some guidance. Do you want me to read his palm and see what it reveals? Kendall inquired, intrigued by the story. Mrs. Bennet nodded eagerly. I've mentioned you to him. Initially, he was unsure, being someone who leans more towards logic and reason, but he's warming up to the idea. His curiosity is piqued. He realizes that even if it doesn't provide concrete answers, the experience might still offer some insight, or at the very least, a unique perspective. Touched by the young man's story, Kendall promised to meet him the following day. She approached the impending reading with a mix of anticipation and caution. Often, individuals turn to her seeking solace more than answers. Kendall recognized the importance of her role. She may not always have the solutions, but she could offer words of comfort and hope. That night, Kendall was gripped by the same haunting nightmare that had plagued her sleep countless times before. In the chilling depths of her dream, her grandmother's face, twisted with a macabre laughter, filled her vision. Holding her precious 3-year-old son Mitchell tightly in her arms, she made a heart-wrenching leap off a jagged cliff, plunging into the fierce and raging river below. Little Mitchell, with his curly hair and innocent eyes, was merely a toddler when the tragedy struck. The community rallied around Kendall during those bleak days. People from all corners poured in to assist. Dedicated volunteers scoured the banks, rescue teams waded through the perilous waters, helicopters hovered above, scanning the expanse, and agile kayak teams navigated treacherous rapids all the way to the waterfall. Yet the waters remained silent, withholding any signs of Mitchell and the grandmother. Kendall was just 25 then, a young mother whose world crumbled in a heartbeat. The weight of the sorrow and shock was so profound that it manifested physically. Her once vibrant hair transformed practically overnight into a ghostly shade of white. The tapestry of Kendall's past was woven with threads of mystery and whispers of secrets. Her childhood was predominantly shaped by the presence of her grandmother, Cassandra, under whose care she grew up in their secluded village. In this quiet hamlet, Cassandra was an enigma. To many villagers, she was an outsider, even though she had lived among them for ages. Suspicion and fear clung to her like a second skin. Hushed voices would label her as unhinged, a witch, or even darker names that children weren't supposed to hear. As a result, Kendall grew up amidst wary glances and whispered conversations. For Kendall, her feelings towards her grandmother were a mix of fear and curiosity. The tales of Cassandra's abilities of seeing beyond the visible were common knowledge. Yet there was a sinister side to her that Kendall couldn't ignore. The late-night visitors, strangers with intense eyes and hushed tones, were a frequent occurrence. During these meetings, Kendall would find herself ushered outside, the house's windows firmly shut, leaving her to wonder and imagine the mysteries unfolding within. Regarding her own parents, Kendall's knowledge was based solely on the sporadic stories her grandmother chose to share. According to Cassandra, they had perished in the car accident when Kendall was but an infant. Whether there was more to this story or not, Kendall couldn't tell. However, one thing was certain. Cassandra firmly believed that Kendall was meant to inherit her peculiar gifts, to continue the legacy that had cast such a formidable shadow over their family. On a fateful day, a group of individuals in crisp suits visited their modest home. As was customary, Cassandra instructed Kendall to play outside. But that day was different. As Kendall busied herself in the yard, an eerie silence enveloped the area. Soon it was punctuated by chilling screams from within the house. Kendall's heart raced, The sounds were unlikely anything she'd heard before. The sky seemed to darken as hours crawled by before the suited visitors finally emerged, their expressions inscrutable. Cassandra, her face drained of color and her hair wildly out of place, stood by the entrance. She was panting heavily, her eyes darting around as if expecting something more. The visitors nodded in gratitude, exchanged a few hushed words with Cassandra, and departed as mysteriously as they had come. Such unsettling incidents sowed seeds of resentment in Kendall towards her grandmother. Yet Cassandra was relentless in her determination to groom Kendall as her successor. "You are the chosen one to carry forward our legacy," she declared with a fiery conviction. "But Grandma, all I wish for is a regular life. To study, to fall in love, to have my own family," Kendall would plead. "That mundane existence is not meant for you. You have a destiny to fulfill," Cassandra would respond dismissively. When Kendall reached the age of 15, the pressure intensified. Cassandra began introducing her to cryptic rituals and incantations, pushing her further into a world she desperately sought to escape from. Pushed to her limits, Kendall became desperate for a way out. By the time she was 17, she'd had enough. Every night, as she lay in bed, she'd craft secret plans to escape her grandmother's suffocating grasp. She yearned for the freedom to live a life away from the mysterious rituals and eerie visitors. One fateful day, with a small bag of essentials and the few savings she had stashed away, Kendall made her move. As dawn's first light painted the horizon, she slipped out of the house. With every step she took, she could feel the weight of her grandmother's expectations lifting off her shoulders. While the thought of Cassandra's rage and potential curses loomed in the back of her mind, the promise of freedom was far too enticing. With limited funds and no formal education, Kendall had to find a way to support herself. Remembering a few hairstyling techniques she had picked up from the local women in the village, she invested her meager savings into a short hairdressing course. After completing her training, she began applying for jobs. Soon enough, she found herself working at a local salon. Day by day, she snipped and styled, slowly building a life for herself. While the job brought stability and some degree of happiness, deep down she felt a void. She missed having a sense of purpose and belonging, and while she escaped one destiny, she now found herself searching for another. Kendall was always enchanted by the world around her. As a child, she adored drawing. Every dawn, she would depict the sun's gentle ascent over the quaint village. Years later, longing for that old joy, she began to draw again. Armed with her art supplies, she'd frequent city parks, immersing herself in the process of capturing life's fleeting moments on paper. Yet, even as her drawings celebrated beauty, a sense of emptiness lingered inside her. Seeking inspiration and solace, Kendall ventured to the coast, yearning for a reprieve from the bustling city life. Perhaps deep down, she was also searching for something or someone more. On one serene evening, as she diligently sketched the amber-hued sunset, a soft melancholic tune wafted through the air. She turned to find its source, a man with a guitar. His music was as soothing as gentle lapping of waves against the shore. Intrigued, she approached him. He introduced himself as Aaron. On the final evening before Kendall had to leave, Aaron performed the heartfelt song he'd written just for her. The words sang of a serendipitous meeting between two souls that led to an unbreakable connection. As he strummed the guitar's last chord, Kendall felt tears fill her eyes. Neither of them wanted to part ways, but circumstances pulled them back into their separate lives. Before going their separate ways, they made a pact to stay in touch, no matter the distance between them. Time rolled on, turning months into years, but their bond only deepened. They exchanged heartfelt letters, shared artistic sketches, composed songs, and nurtured dreams of being together in the future. 2 years later, Aaron surprised Kendall in the most magical way. He appeared at her doorstep, guitar slung over his shoulder, ready to serenade her. He played a newly written song that concluded with a marriage proposal. They exchanged their wedding vows in the same quaint coastal town where their paths had first crossed. After that, they spent some time exploring the world, sharing their passion for art and music with everyone they met. Eventually, they welcomed their first child, a baby they named Mitchell. It was then that they decided to put down roots and create a stable home. Life seemed to be nothing short of perfect. Their little family blossomed, their love serving as the strongest foundation. As the years went by, Kendall found herself reflecting more on memories of her grandmother. A lingering guilt weighed on her heart for having left her aging grandmother behind. When she shared her thoughts about visiting her grandmother with Aaron, he was immediately supportive. Yet when he agreed, Kendall gave him a playful smirk, hinting that he might not fully grasp the complexity of her relationship with her grandmother. After in-depth conversations and weighing the pros and cons, Kendall made up her mind to pay her grandmother a visit. They agreed that if her grandmother was not in good health or needed more support, they'd bring her back to live with them. After all, it was essential for Kendall to make peace with her past. Upon their arrival, Kendall was taken aback by how her grandmother appeared seemingly unchanged by time. It was as if the years had been kind to her. With open arms and a bright smile, she welcomed Kendall and Aaron into her home. For dinner, she had prepared an array of scrumptious dishes, setting a table fit for a feast. As they ate, she regaled Aaron with stories of Kendall's childhood, painting a vivid picture of the girl who would become the woman he loved. Kendall was relieved and grateful that her grandmother made no mention of their past disagreements, at least for the time being. Later, the three of them decided to stroll by the riverbank, allowing Aaron to take in the beauty of the surroundings. As the shimmering waters reflected the dying light of the evening, Cassandra broke the comfortable silence, addressing the elephant in the room. "Kendall," she began, her tone somber, "I sense that my time here is limited. There are certain matters we need to address urgently." Confusion clouded Kendall's face, and seeing this, her grandmother elaborated, "You need to inherit all that I possess." Recognition dawned on Kendall, and her heart sank. Her grandmother was still keen on passing on her unique abilities to her. Taking a deep breath, Kendall responded with firmness, "Grandma, I've made it clear from the beginning. I will not be part of that legacy," she said, hoping her grandmother would finally understand. As Kendall tried to reason with her grandmother, Cassandra's demeanor shifted noticeably. Her eyes, once soft and inviting, now held a stern and piercing gaze. "You don't have a say in this," her grandmother murmured almost menacingly. Feeling a mix of confusion and apprehension, Kendall implored, "Gran, please, let's not go down this path. And why are you looking at me with such intensity?" But before she could get an answer, in a sudden and unexpected move, Cassandra's face twisted into a sinister grin. She snatched young Mitchell from Kendall's arms and shoved her. The force was so overwhelming that Kendall found herself sprawling on the ground, dangerously close to the cliff's precipice. Mitchell, still in Cassandra's grip, was perilously near the edge. Panicking, Kendall tried to scramble towards them, but Aaron, who had been a bit farther back and unaware of the unfolding drama, rushed forward and grasped her, preventing a potential fall. His eyes wide with fear, they both looked up to confront Cassandra's next move. Over the subsequent 2 years, an overwhelming grief consumed Kendall. Hospital admissions became a recurring event for her, each discharge soon followed by another admission due to her distressing attempts to reunite with her lost son. Mitchell had been her world, her anchor. With his absence, her life felt void of purpose and meaning. Aaron, struggling to cope with his own sorrow, hoped to find healing in the possibility of starting a family once more. But the mere suggestion fell on deaf ears, as Kendall was too ensnared in her anguish to consider a future. Their relationship, once built on shared dreams and mutual love, began to deteriorate. Heated arguments took their toll. Aaron's misplaced anger led him to cruelly blame Kendall's lineage, insinuating that her connection to a so-called witch was the root of their misery. These accusations deeply wounded Kendall, pushing her further into despair. The emotional chasm between them grew, their once burning love now a flickering flame. One bleak morning, Kendall was greeted with silence and a note by her bedside. Aaron had gathered his belongings and departed. The letter's words, though intended to be kind, echoed the loneliness that Kendall felt. She was on her own again, left to grapple with a heart heavy with loss. On a particular gloomy day, Kendall found herself wandering aimlessly around the park, lost in her thoughts. Unexpectedly, an elderly woman with deep lines etching her face walked straight up to her. Without any pleasantries or introduction, the woman questioned Kendall sharply. "What are you trying to achieve? They won't welcome you on the other side, you know. You might as well stop attempting to go there." Kendall froze, taken aback by the old woman's directness. "What do you mean? Who are you?" The woman's eyes held a mysterious depth. "You understand exactly what I'm implying. Your journey in this world isn't over, and it seems there are still purposes for you to fulfill." Kendall's voice quivered with a mix of confusion and desperation. "Purposes? For whom? My son is gone and my husband has abandoned me. Who could possibly need me now?" "Sometimes," the woman began, pausing momentarily to choose her words wisely, "our understanding of things is limited. Perhaps there's more to your story than you currently perceive." As the woman turned to leave, Kendall's eyes were drawn to her hand, observing an intricate pattern of lines that seemed eerily familiar. Glancing at her own palm, she felt as though the lines were trying to communicate something vital, a message or a path. But at that moment, the meaning remained elusive. Kendall had spent half a decade mastering the art of reading destiny lines on palms. While many whispered that she had inherited this gift from her grandmother, Kendall was adamant that her skills were self-acquired. Starting with casual readings for neighbors, she soon became a sought-after palmist, with her impeccable accuracy drawing people from far and wide. Yet there was an odd quirk. She couldn't decipher the lines in her own palm or those of her direct family. Given her lack of close family ties, this limitation barely fazed her. On this particular night, after a vivid dream, she was convinced sleep would be elusive. She tried to distract herself with tea and a book in the kitchen, only to unexpectedly doze off on an uncomfortable couch. The oddity of this event wasn't lost on her. She felt like a child again, capable of drifting off without worries. Checking the clock, she realized she had enjoyed a peaceful 2-hour slumber. Pulling herself together, Kendall recalled she had an appointment with Mrs. Bennet. Always conscious of her punctuality, Kendall made a mental note to pick up some sweets as a gesture for their meeting. Although she had taken a break from her work, her financial state was robust, thanks to the appreciative tokens of gratitude from her clients. Outside, Mrs. Bennet greeted her warmly. "Kendall, it warms my heart that you held on to our agreement." "Why would I back out, Mrs. Bennet? I gave my word." "Just a quick detour to a store for some sweets, all right?" "Oh, Kendall, your kindness never ceases to amaze." They flagged down a taxi, and as they nestled into the back seat, the driver swiveled around. The air grew thick, the weight of years of silence pressing in. Kendall? Her heart missed a beat. Aaron? It was him, her former husband, the man who had walked away from their shared life. Memories of the note he had left came flooding back, reopening old wounds. "I'd never leave you, especially after what we've been through, but I can't understand why you're hurting yourself like this. It's like you're lost, forgetting about others and their feelings. You seem so wrapped up in yourself." Aaron saw that Kendall was different now. She had moved on from her sorrow and started a fresh chapter in her life. "You look well, Kendall," Aaron remarked after a pause. "You too, Aaron." During the ride, the atmosphere was thick with silent tension. Aaron had assisted Kendall with loading the sweets, and now every so often she could feel his eyes on her, taking her in, trying to discern the changes in the woman he had once known. Mrs. Bennet, ever the observant woman, picked up on the fragile dynamic between the two and decided to stay quiet, allowing space for whatever might unfold between them. Upon reaching their destination, an overpowering, stale smell invaded their senses. Kendall crinkled her nose, clearly repulsed, but tried to push her discomfort aside. Guiding them, Mrs. Bennet said, "This way," her voice echoing slightly in the grim hallway. As Kendall walked behind her, Aaron's words echoed in her mind. The promises of waiting, the hurt of abandonment, it all rushed back. Soon they reached the room. There, Kendall's gaze was drawn to a young man seated in a wheelchair. Mrs. Bennet had spoken about him. Though many at the institution were confined to wheelchairs, this young man was different. His eyes, deep, probing, held a certain intensity. After handing out the sweets and witnessing the pure joy in the eyes of the residents, Kendall felt a warmth spread through her. Their smiles, the tiny nods of appreciation, it was all heartening. At last, she approached the young man. "What's your name?" she asked gently. "Brian," he replied, his voice firm. "You're the one they talk about, right? The palm reader who claims to see things?" Kendall chuckled softly. "I just read palms, no magic involved. It's a skill, learned over time. Would you like to see for yourself?" Brian flashed a tentative smile. "Is it okay if I ask you something?" "Absolutely," she replied. "If what you see in my palm is bleak, could you reassure me? Just let me know things will turn around. I really need a glimmer of hope right now." Kendall's eyes softened with empathy. "Do you have any family, Brian?" He shook his head. "I was abandoned at a hospital doorstep when I was just a baby. The doctors told me that if I'd gotten timely medical attention for my injury, I might have been able to walk. I think whoever tried to treat me couldn't do it right, and perhaps, feeling overwhelmed, they left me at the hospital. I always thought it might have been my parents. Maybe I was too much for them to handle." Kendall reached out, comforting him. "Brian, we can't say for sure if it was your parents. Sometimes life puts us in hard situations, but for now, let's focus on reading your palm, okay?" He nodded, taking a deep breath. "All right, let's see." She hesitated for a moment, then asked gently, "Ready?" Brian slowly extended his hand towards her. When Kendall's fingers brushed against his palm, an unexpected cold sensation spread through her. She quickly pulled away. Strangely, she saw nothing, which had only ever occurred when she tried to read the palms of close family members. Catching her breath, she looked into Brian's eyes, filled with a mix of confusion and concern. "Is something wrong, ma'am? What did you see?" Brian questioned, his voice laced with concern. Kendall remained silent for a moment, visibly shaken. She then took a deep, steadying breath and touched Brian's palm again. The sensation was overwhelming. She felt as if she were being pulled into a whirlpool, entering a mysterious dimension. Images of a vibrant red and yellow tunnel swirled around her as if she were being sucked into its depth. She tried to release his hand, but it was as if they were bound together. Suddenly, the chaos subsided, replaced by a blinding whiteness. As the white fog gradually lifted, Kendall recognized the local river from their village. She was abruptly snapped back to the present, instinctively pulling her hand away. A wave of dizziness hit her, causing her vision to blur. Panicking, Kendall bolted from the room. Mrs. Bennet, taken aback by the unexpected turn of events, quickly chased after her. Left alone, Brian felt an overwhelming flood of emotions. Tears streamed down his face, not fully understanding the depth of his connection to Kendall or the intense feelings that overwhelmed him. He longed to chase after her, to seek answers, but the weight of his emotions anchored him to the spot. As Kendall burst through the door, she almost collided with Aaron, her ex-husband, who had been taking a leisurely walk outside. While he was curious about Kendall's whereabouts, he didn't want to intrude, but as she emerged so suddenly, Aaron instinctively reached out, saving her from a potential fall. She collapsed into his arms, her tears flowing freely. "Kendall, what's going on? Talk to me." Aaron's voice was filled with concern. The sudden outburst drew a crowd. Mrs. Bennet rushed to the porch, her face a mask of worry, followed closely by Brian and a few others from the house. Nurses, hearing the noise, came out from various doors trying to understand the situation. Kendall's eyes brimmed with tears, making it hard for her to see clearly. Aaron gently gripped her face, forcing her to look at him. "What did you see? Tell me." "It's Mitchell. Aaron, our son, Mitchell." Kendall's voice was choked with emotion. Aaron recoiled, disbelief evident in his eyes. "What? Are you sure? How can that be?" His gaze followed Kendall's, and for the first time, he really saw the young man behind her. Mrs. Bennet's eyes grew wide, her hand covering her mouth as realization dawned. The striking resemblance between Brian and Aaron was undeniable. Amidst the confusion, nobody noticed Brian's reaction to the revelations. The weight of the situation pressing on him, he looked lost and vulnerable. As Kendall's gaze met his tear-filled eyes, she rushed to him. Although Brian tried to wheel away, his emotions slowing him down, Kendall reached him quickly, her heart pouring out for the boy she believed to be her son. "Mitchell, please try to understand." Kendall's voice quivered with emotion. Both Aaron and Kendall knew they owed their son an explanation. They took a deep breath and their story unfurled. Long ago, following a traumatic incident near the river, Mitchell was discovered on a bank. abandoned for reasons unknown. The circumstances of how he ended up there remained a mystery. A well-meaning soul may have intended to care for the child, but upon realizing his injuries, they made the heartbreaking decision to leave him at the hospital. The attending doctors, unaware of his true identity, named him Brian. Tears, revelations, and heartfelt conversations followed. By the end of it all, Aaron and Kendall decided they needed to be a united front for Mitchell. They were determined to put their past behind them, forging a new path for their family. As for Cassandra, she remained an enigma. Her home stood desolate, untouched, with local legends whispering about its haunting past. Mitchell's injury meant he would always rely on a wheelchair. By the age of 15, he had adapted to his reality, but his heart yearned for answers, particularly about Cassandra. Kendall dodged this topic, but Mitchell's relentless curiosity persisted. He needed to understand why his grandmother would have taken such a drastic step that fateful day. One day, he enlisted the help of a school friend, and soon their duo expanded to a quartet. Fueled by teenage curiosity, they embarked on a journey to the old village. As Mitchell gazed at the house, memories passed down from his mother echoed in his mind. Together, the group of friends decided to explore. With a nudge and a push, they managed to get inside. As Mitchell wheeled himself around, one room caught his attention. Dimly lit by candles and cloaked in thick, dark drapes, the room exuded an eerie vibe. A chill ran down their spines as they contemplated the room's mysterious past. Suddenly, there was a sharp rap on the door, which the group had inadvertently left ajar. They turned to see an elderly woman, her face lined with age, framed in the doorway. The group instinctively retreated a step. The woman's gaze was piercing, moving from one face to another, settling with a mix of suspicion and reprimand. Mitchell, sensing it was his place to speak, wheeled himself forward. "Why are you here? What are you looking for in this house?" she demanded. Clearing her throat, Mitchell replied, "My name is Mitchell. This used to be my mom's home, and my grandmother lived here too." The woman's eyes widened in shock and recognition at Mitchell's words. "I want to know why my grandmother tried to harm me," Mitchell continued, his voice firm yet filled with emotion. The old woman's composure faltered. She seemed conflicted, torn between her desire to protect her old secrets and her conscience. She swiftly ushered Mitchell and his friends outside. Moving quickly to her parked car, she rummaged through her handbag and handed Mitchell a piece of paper. "If you truly seek answers," she said, her voice trembling, "come to this address." The slip had an address scribbled on it, presumably her own. The woman's behavior suggested that there were deeper, darker tales tied to the house and its past occupants. That evening, under the dim glow of Mrs. Wright's living room light, Mitchell braced himself for a revelation that would forever change his understanding of his family. Mrs. Wright, with her gray hair pulled back and glasses perched on her nose, was a fixture in the village. Having spent her entire life there, she had seen its history, its secrets, and its stories unfold. She was intimately familiar with Cassandra's reputation. The village had always spoken about her in hushed tones, whispering tales of her mystical dealings. People avoided her, not just out of disdain, but out of a genuine fear of her rumored powers. As Mitchell looked into Mrs. Wright's earnest eyes, she began, "I'll share something with you, but it remains between us. Can you promise that?" Mitchell nodded. "I promise, ma'am." Taking a deep breath, she continued, "Cassandra isn't your blood relative grandmother. Your mother was, in fact, sold by her biological parents to Cassandra, but nobody ever spoke up. Nobody corrected the tales, all because of the looming shadow of Cassandra's alleged curse." Mitchell felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. The truth was far more convoluted than he had ever imagined. Mrs. Wright took a deep breath before diving into the intricate details of the past. "Cassandra's anger towards you wasn't really about you," she began, her voice shaking slightly. "It was about her own pain. You see, Cassandra couldn't have children of her own. It was a wound that never healed for her. So when she saw Kendall, her adopted daughter, with a child, her envy spiraled out of control." Shuffling uncomfortably in her chair, Mrs. Wright continued, "Now about Kendall's biological parents. They had many mouths to feed and very little means to do so. Times were tough. and when an opportunity came knocking in the form of a significant sum of money for one of their children, they made the heart-wrenching decision to sell Kendall. It was in their minds a sacrifice for the well-being of their other children. Mrs. Wright's eyes looked distant, lost in the memories. With the money from the sale, they left the village. At first, there were whispers and rumors about where they had gone and the newfound wealth they flaunted. But as the years rolled by, their memories faded, replaced by new stories and newer concerns. 2 years swiftly passed, and as the seasons changed, so did the circumstances. One sunny afternoon, a sleek car pulled up outside Kendall's house. Aaron stepped out, looking around with a smile. He then extended a helping hand to Mitchell, who emerged from the vehicle with newfound determination. The once wheelchair-bound young man was now standing on his own 2 feet, albeit with a bit of help. A recent surgery had given him the hope and ability to walk again. Inside the car, Aaron pulled out a large bouquet of vibrant flowers, handing it over to Mitchell. "For your mom," he whispered. Locking eyes with Mitchell, Aaron's expression was a mix of pride and joy. "Are you ready to give your mom the best birthday surprise?" Mitchell nodded, clutching the bouquet. As they approached the entrance, he took tentative steps, gaining confidence with each one. Seeing Aaron's outstretched hand ready to steady him, Mitchell gently pushed it away, wanting to prove his newfound independence. Mrs. Bennet, observing the touching scene from her perch on a garden bench, felt tears brimming in her eyes, overwhelmed by the progress and the strength of the family bond. With all the revelations of the past, Mitchell had chosen a path of resilience and forgiveness. He may never fully understand or come to terms with his grandparents' choices, but he was adamant about shielding his mother from any more pain. She had endured enough, and it was time for her to experience the happiness she so rightly deserved.